Hey everyone, I'm artist and science illustrator Mattias Lanas. Today we'll be playing with a fun, dynamic technique to create a snowy blizzard effect in a watercolor painting. This demonstration is influenced by one of the pieces artist-explorer Tony Foster created for his Exploring Beauty Watercolor Diaries from the Wild Journey, specifically in the Tibetan Himalayas about 16,000 feet above sea level near Mount Everest. In 2007, Tony Foster traveled to the Kama Valley in the Himalayas on the suggestion of accomplished British mountaineer Stephen Venables, who was the first Briton to climb Everest without supplemental oxygen. Venables considers the Kama Valley to be one of the most breathtaking places in the world. For this painting, called The East Kongshung Face of Everest from above the Kama Valley, Tony Foster chose to depict the valley complete with colorful Tibetan prayer flags, swirling fog, a rushing river cutting through the middle of the valley, and Mount Everest poking out of the clouds in the far back. However, Tony also produced a smaller piece called An Unnamed Rock Face Looking West from My Tent Above the Kama Valley, while stranded inside his tent during blizzard conditions, unable to come out to continue his work. In exasperation, Tony decided to paint this view directly outside of his tent. In an inscription, he writes, "During brief moments between blizzard and low cloud, I emerge to draw and paint," and "The subject is never clear. I work as best I can." This is one of my favorite pieces, both because of the backstory and because of how dynamic and full of energy the resulting piece is. The swirling snow effect was created at the very end, once the watercolors were dry, by using a fine blade scraped against the paper to remove the overlying paint. It's this technique that we'll be focusing on today as we paint our own snowy winter scenes. One of the challenges with watercolor is making sure to leave enough whites in your composition as you layer color over color, darker and darker. Normally, this is done through planning and patiently leaving certain areas devoid of paint as you work, or by using masking fluid to temporarily protect areas from color. Scraping the watercolor paper with a blade to reveal underlying white is another way of achieving this. The result, however, physically damages the paper surface, so it's no longer quite workable for painting afterwards. Scraping produces a stark, broken edge that is perfect for a lot of white subject matter, including snow, ocean, surf, clouds, bright highlights, but it's too harsh and aggressive for more delicate white highlights. It's also emotionally difficult to literally take a knife to your work after you've spent all of that time on the painting, but the results are well worth it. Today, we will work from this photograph of mine and transform our painting from a serene, snowy landscape into a frenzied snowstorm scene. If you'll be following along with me today, make sure you first watch my materials video to understand what you'll need. I'll be using a basic watercolor setup today, including watercolor paper, a pencil and eraser, water, watercolor paints and brushes, and a paper towel. And of course, an artist's knife or Exacto blade to create the blizzard effect at the end. Gather up these supplies and make sure to have the photo reference handy, and let's get going. So today's demonstration will be overall shorter. I'll be focusing on that technique of scraping the paper, removing pigment, and revealing the white underneath to create our snowstorm effect. Just to speed things up though, I've started with a drawing based off of the reference photo. I've got the tree drawn out fairly dark because it's going to be a high contrast scene. I've got mostly white in the snow in the foreground and then white in the sky full of clouds, and so this tree is going to be very dark by comparison, all these bushes as well and the mountains as well. So it doesn't matter that I've pressed down very hard because that's all going to be very dark anyways, and it's helpful for me to see that. And notice I'm not using any tape for my borders here. I've decided to have loose borders that will be organic and defined by the watercolor wash edges. But if you want to, you may definitely tape up a border and create a very sharp rectangle for yourself with a clean edge. So after you've done your drawing like this, the next thing we're going to do is move on to washes. I'm going to prepare my watercolors by using a broad brush today. And for a lot of these neutral grays that we're seeing in this scene, I'm going to be using a bunch of French Ultramarine and mute that down with some umbers or some warm yellows so that we get something that doesn't look so blue. So I'll start out by wetting my colors, getting them primed and ready, and create a pool of French ultramarine that will be a main reservoir from which to draw for my washes. To this we'll add some burnt sienna to really mute this down. Do a quick test down here outside of my frame. That looks good. It doesn't look very blue to me anymore. So I'm going to take what's in my brush right now of this color, and I'll create a new reservoir over here and dilute it much more, because this is going to be the foundation for my sky and all those grays and blues I've got in there. So let's see, make sure I don't have too much pigment in there. I want it to be very subtle. Let's test that out. Oh yeah, very subtle. Great. Okay, so now, mostly rinsing off my brush. It's okay if a little color's in there because these skies are fairly dark, but we're gonna just take mostly water and create a wash over this entire area. And it's okay if you go over your tree because it's so dark. The only parts you don't want to go over are the white areas, like the snow down here, anything below the mountain. So I'm keeping above the mountain range right now. And you're using this as well, as I mentioned, to define your borders. So decide what kind of border you want. Do you want a bit more of a rectangular one, or do you want it round? I'm going to leave mine a bit more rectangular, but still fairly organic. All right, got the water in here. And now we're going to drop in some of our color. If it's really wet, you may need to wait a second. Mine might be slightly too wet, but I'm going to try it for now. See what happens. Drop in some of these colors. You want these darker ones to be closer to the horizon here. Not too much at the top because it doesn't look as dark up there. And I may even take a smidge more of the French ultramarine. Make sure it's not much if you want to make it slightly more blue. In my case, it's going a bit gray, and that's okay, but I think it would look livelier with some blue, so just a little bit right now. I'm being very loose about this because, again, my goal isn't about accurately representing this landscape, but it's capturing some of its essence and overall providing a foundation from which to later do my scraping and create that snowstorm effect. We're taking this serene, snowy white scene and we're turning it into something a bit more dynamic. So, mostly horizontal shapes, but again, this is all going to be diffused and smooth out as the watercolor dries. Noticing a bit of a dark over here behind the tree, so I'm adding in a bit of that. Really enjoy this part. This is a lot of fun. It should be fun. It's very loose. That might be enough for now. I'm going to let this dry, and in the meantime move to this section up here, which is by contrast lighter, or it appears to be lighter. So I'm not going to do too much to it. Maybe we'll use this bit of blue that I have in here, really dilute that with water, because I want it to be mostly white. Let's call it just off-white. Let's test right there. That's pretty white. That's great. I don't know if you can see that test right there. Okay, so we'll use that to create a wash layer down here. Same thing, kind of following these contours that I've created for myself. This imaginary box that I'm creating, giving life to. And sometimes less is more. A lot of times less is more actually in watercolor. So I might just leave this as is like that. Get this little hair out. Maybe a little bit of color, like almost a hint of a shadow right here below this mound that we have. But not too much. All right, I think I'm good. I'm going to let this dry. All right, so in waiting for this to dry, I've decided that the clouds need to be a bit more ominous, a bit more menacing to create a darker sky background that'll contrast more nicely against the scrapes that we're going to do. So let's add another wash of dark to this. Let's make it not as wet, but allow it to still cover most of the page. So mixing up this color again, do a quick test down here, something dark. Let's do that, and we're just gonna go for it. I'll start from the bottom and do a bit of a graded wash. So adding a layer down here, make sure it's fully dry before you do this. And then work my way up. Add a bit of water as I go up so that this becomes less intense, like this. More water, and all the way at the top. It's something. So I added another layer, and now if I need to, I can go over this and add even more darks. Maybe emphasize some of the clouds I'm seeing in the middle, keeping it loose and light with my brush, and getting water if I need to. All right, so to me that looks a lot more menacing and dark. We're gonna let that dry now. Okay, now that this is truly dry, we'll move on to the mountains in the back. So I'm gonna use a smaller flat brush like this for those and mix up some of the same color that I'd mixed up originally. So this dulled down or muted down French ultramarine, rehydrating this, and maybe actually increase the intensity of this. So add more of both pigments, because it feels a little watered down to me, even in this form. Let's see some of that, some burnt sienna, and maybe we'll err on the slightly blue side for these, because in this photo they do look a bit more blue. How about something like that? Let's see. Looks good. So I'm just gonna come in and carefully add this blue right up to the edge of the mountains. Nothing fancy. And then when I come down to the bottom edge, I want to make sure that I go right up against that horizontal line I've drawn, because any deviation there is going to look a little strange. We have a pretty flat snow foreground, and so we want to convey that idea. Just turn it to make this easier for myself. Basically, going right up against this line. Great, and now I'm gonna intensify this color right here. Same thing, so more French ultramarine. We're gonna increase the pigment load in here. Some burnt sienna. And while this is still slightly damp, I can start to just create a bit more contrast in certain areas. Maybe up here. One of the tough things about watercolor is that it tends to dry lighter than what you put down, and so it can be hard to gauge what the right intensity is, but you get accustomed to that over time, and you get better and better at understanding how that works. So mostly went over the whole thing. I'm going to turn this sideways again. I'm also going to bring this darkness that I just created all the way to the bottom, because I want the bottom part down here to be overall darker, and I'm going to just keep layering, keep glazing over that until it gets really dark, close to black. So now while we wait for that to dry, we're going to mix up a really dark black color. So we don't want to go straight into a black tube of paint. We want to mix up something that's harmonious with this scene, so it contains some of these same colors, but just a very dark form of those. So we'll start, since we don't need too much more of this color, we'll just use this as our base and build upon it. So let's take more of that burnt sienna. We'll go brown, getting a lot of burnt sienna. And then let's take a lot of French ultramarine. Start layering that in, adding that in. Look how rich this is getting, really black and dark. Bit more French ultramarine. I'm using very little water, just what I have here. Okay, lots of French ultramarine. It's looking a little blue, so a bit more burnt sienna. A rich, beautiful black that we've created, and we can test that out. Oh, and look at that, very intense. So that's exactly what we want. I'm going to leave this brush for now, make sure to remove some of the pigment before I change, and switch to a more detailed, smaller brush that will allow me to do some of the fine work of this tree and then the surrounding vegetation. So with this brush, just lightly moisten it and then collect some of this and simply come in and start creating my tree. And as I said in the beginning, I'm not going to worry too much about accuracy for this one. I'm overall just trying to capture the feel of this landscape. So I'm just going to be very loose with my strokes, try to get the overall sense of this tree. Almost scribbly. And I'm layering this watercolor pretty thick because I just want it to look like it's in silhouette, this tree. And with some subjects like this, I actually will take my pencil, and since it's got such a sharp point and I'm working so small, I might as well take advantage of this pencil to get some extra sharp darks in there. If you're going to work over the watercolor, it's better to wait till it's completely dry, but since I'm just kind of working in between and around the watercolor, I can come in right away. This just helps me add a bit more of this tree texture to this, and I can really load the pressure on the pencil to get more of the effect I'm looking for. And then more down here as well, using my thin brush again. Very loose, very playful, lots of little dabbing movements, organic, somewhat conforming to what I'm seeing in the photograph, but overall just capturing a sense of this scene. Lots of scrubby brushiness. And then a sharp edge at the bottom where I see this snow meeting this small hill, scrubby hill. All right. So my color over here is drying up. I'm gonna grab a little bit of water to rehydrate this. Maybe switch back to my flat brush so that I can scoop some more pigment, some more color into this. And just repeat the same colors. It's amazing we're doing this piece with just two colors, burnt sienna and then French ultramarine. Got this color built up again. Switch to my other brush and just touch up some areas. You can use this to darken as well if I feel like there's some areas that didn't get enough darks. Come back into the tree, for example, any areas that are just missing some additional darkness. They're too light or too blue or too transparent. And then use the rest of this color to add in this layer of closer forested hills that we see between the white bottom down here and the background mountains. And they look like they have little trees on the top, so I'm gonna make those marks as I do this and then fill in the rest. Switch to this brush for this bit. It's helpful for me to turn my paper when I'm doing these flat lines. It's easier to do, for whatever reason, I find it easier to do them vertical rather than horizontal. Maybe a couple more darks here. And then let's call it. So we've got our general winter scene created. And then on top of this, we're going to do what I've been waiting for this whole time. which is the scraping away, but first we have to let this dry completely. So for the last part, let's get rid of these watercolors. We're gonna take our blade and basically run it in a horizontal manner across the surface of the page, using the blade edge to gently do some abrasion on the paper. So I'm going to start very gently and then proceed with more pressure as I get more comfortable. But you don't want to use the tip, you want to use the side and just try to control it in a way where you get these raspy blizzard-like swirls. You can see I'm removing some of the watercolor. I'm also totally damaging the paper, but that's okay because I'm done with the watercolor bit. And some I'm going to do a little bit like this, sort of more vertical, because it'll be more dynamic. Try to break up this horizon line a little bit. All right, look at that. Maybe a little too extreme in some areas. Let's see if I can erase some of this with my eraser. The effect is what we were looking for, this really energetic, swirling snow, frenzied, dynamic snowstorm. Wasn't that an interesting watercolor technique? I hope you found it fun and that scraping up your work at the end wasn't too stressful. I encourage you to experiment using a knife to add highlights and other subtle white details to other watercolor subjects. As a watercolorist, it's a handy trick to have up your sleeve. If you enjoyed this episode, please give this video a like and subscribe to the Foster's channel. The other videos in this series are available on YouTube and also on the Foster website at www.thefoster.org. Thanks for watching.